We haven't got to the doomsday scenario where the oil goes to $150 and the whole world goes into recession. But that depends on the Strait of Hormuz being open. Is it open? No, it's not. It depends on the ceasefire holding. Has it held? It hasn't held.
If this ends without a formal agreement and just sort of sputters to a halt, the Gulf states are left in such an exposed position.
I think it has landed with Donald Trump that this is unpopular, that this is doing badly for him. And that surely weakens his ability and his credibility now in terms of where we could come back. Hello and welcome to Fourcast Indicators for a Middle East ceasefire special with me, Krishnan Guru-Murthy, alongside the defence and intelligence analyst, Mark Urban.
On Forecast Indicators, we'll look at the signals analysts watch most closely. We'll separate the wheat from the chaff, the noise from the signal, the telltale signs that suggest imminent and significant change may be coming. And this week, we're joined by Economics Editor Helia Ebrahimi with her analysis of the key economic indicators driving the markets.
So does this ceasefire have a real chance of becoming a lasting peace, and has a global economic crisis been averted at the last minute, or perhaps just kicked down the road until it flares up again? Now, as we speak, Mark, we're in this sort of curious phase where we're waiting for talks to begin in Pakistan between JD Vance for the Americans and the Iranian speaker Ghalibaf, who appears to be the man the Americans think is in charge. But it may not happen, given what's been going on in Lebanon.
Yes, indeed. And so that's my first indicator. Not quite does Ghalibaf turn up, which is clearly rather a critical thing to happen for there to be talks. But is there an understanding about Lebanon being part of this deal or not? Because he's posted on social media that it has to be. I mean, he's drawn it even more broadly than that, hasn't he? And therefore, does Trump say to the Israelis, cool it in Lebanon, even if it's just temporarily? I mean, we really don't know exactly how this is going to play out. But the signs on the ground are that definitely the Israelis are not going at targets in Lebanon in the way they were in such a spectacular and costly in human terms way yesterday.
I mean, the Americans are sort of saying, well, this is sort of crossed wires. I mean, certainly it is true that in the first couple of weeks of the war when I was in Israel, the assumption was that Lebanon is a separate theatre, as it has been before, that there was a war in Lebanon that was separate to the 12-day war with Iran, separate to Gaza, and that's its own thing. And even if the Americans want to cool it in Iran, then we'll decide when we stop in Lebanon. But that is clearly not what Iran thinks now, or what the Pakistani Prime Minister, who was, well, on the face of it at least, brokering the talks, thought in his tweets where he announced it included Lebanon.
Yes. I mean, look, if you go back before the 7th of October, Israeli strategic theory or intelligence analysis was that Hezbollah was there as a sort of supreme deterrent to stop people attacking Iran, particularly Israel, obviously, and that if Israel attacked Iran, there'd be this huge rocket barrage. Then during the campaign in the latter part of 2024, the Israelis managed to break the linkage both with Iran, which did not immediately respond with enormous bombardments to help Hezbollah, and with Hamas, where a lot of people had said, no, Hezbollah can't be split and just leave Hamas to fight the Israelis on their own. But in the end, they were. Now, of course, we now know that the deal done then was not as enduring or definitive as the Israelis in particular would like to have hoped. But that whole question about linkage is always there between Hezbollah and Iran. And so does Iran decide that actually, in terms of rebuilding Hezbollah, it's maybe not such a bad thing if they stop too? These are complex equations that are very hard to read right now.
I mean, Helia, as things stand, does it look like disaster is averted, or have we just not realised how much damage has already been done?
Well, look, there's a very fragile de-escalation that takes away the immediate risk, but hasn't really solved any of the fundamental problems. And I was looking at the oil price just before we came into the studio, and it's just shy of $100. Now, that means we haven't got to the doomsday scenario where the oil goes to $150 and the whole world goes into recession. So there is an idea that you could get a very short, sharp inflation shock that at a macroeconomic level is resolved by the end of the year. But that depends on the Strait of Hormuz being open. Is it open? No, it's not. It depends on the ceasefire holding. Has it held? It hasn't held already. And it requires people to know how to operate in the Strait of Hormuz. And so far, ship companies, buyers of oil and gas, and indeed the Gulf states don't quite know how this toll system, how this new reality is going to work. And already people are feeling what this conflict means in terms of airfares, in terms of petrol prices, in terms of transport costs.
Well, what's your key indicator then? In terms
I would say,
is it working?
Yeah, well, the key you have to look at is how many ships are getting out of the Strait of Hormuz and how many are getting out? Hardly any. There should be about 130 ships that get out of the Strait of Hormuz.
Every day.
Every day. And that is not happening at the moment. This is day one. And not only that, is that Lloyd's List is talking about ship owners not understanding who they're going to pay this toll to. The IRGC today have put out this map saying, be warned, all of these locations have mines, so avoid those and come through this passage. But people don't know how they're going to pay this. Are they going to pay in crypto? Are they going to pay in yuan? Yeah, well, because the Iranians want to avoid dollars, basically. But how does that system work? You know, can ship... there was one conversation I was having about whether insurers would end up footing this bill, because could you claim it through some kind of piracy? But none of this has been tested out in the courts, in the real world. So it's not working so far. And the problem you have is we haven't had oil shortages for this month because we're all using the oil from February. Starting from now, just from now, we are definitively going to have less oil and less gas in the world.
So one of the things, another interesting indicator, which I spotted yesterday, was Oman saying they wouldn't go along with the toll booth system. Yeah. Now, obviously, they're on the other side of
territorial waters.
Exactly. And there are these rumours in shipping circles that ships have been switching off their AIS, their identification system, and sneaking through Omani waters. Is there anything in that, do you think?
Well, I think there's definitely proof that people have been switching off the AIS to disappear. But it's obviously very dangerous. I mean, people have been talking about it's uninsurable. Well, yes, it is insurable, but at a very, very high cost. And you're endangering the crew on board because can you get through? The Omanis, the Iranians are saying, IRGC are saying actually that they're going to share this new toll, new high charge reality with the Omanis. But there's a big discussion, we were talking this morning, Krish, about, is it free waters? The head of the International Maritime Organization was saying this morning, these are free waters governed by a treaty under the UN, and the Iranians have no legal rights. Obviously, Iran feels very differently.
Well, that's the UN Conference on the Law of the Sea, to which they argue that there's a specific article that they didn't accede to, relating to the right of transit, apparently. So they're trying to carve out a legal argument for why it's legal. But of course, it's completely different, isn't it, to the Suez Canal or the Panama Canal,
man-made
waterways, in which the people who dug them had to get their money back.
But it does. I mean, you can see that clearly there's lots of commercial activity in those man-made canals. In fact, Panama Canal has become even more commercial with interests like the U.S. president, making sure that Blackstone got investment in. So you can see why the Iranian authorities, when they're saying there's been so much infrastructure damage, why they would want to recoup some of that money. I think what's not clear is even if you accept that, which the Saudis are unlikely to, how do you then operate that? Who does the money go to, and what's the system that operates that toll being paid?
I mean, the really extraordinary thing in the last couple of days has also been, though, that while Oman says we don't want to operate a toll, the person who says he does is Donald Trump.
Absolutely.
And who says it's a beautiful thing, that maybe he will share this. Now, I mean, I was talking to Yvette Cooper this morning, and she was criticizing the Iranian idea at tolls. I said, well, it's not just the Iranians, is it? It's the Americans as well. And she was saying, no, it's not. It's not really. I said, well, he said it on the record, sort of, that he thinks it's a great idea.
There's a lot of things on the record, though.
And she was sort of poo-pooing it and saying, well, yes, but we've been talking to the American authorities in great detail about this, and they're not really going to get involved. But it tells you something about the mindset of Donald Trump, that he is still in that, what can I get out of this? Because he is very well aware that as things stand, they're in a worse situation to the one they were in before the war, whether it's in terms of the straits or any of the other military assets as well.
I mean, Helia, it's interesting that you mentioned the Saudis there, because, of course, you've got this block of major oil producers, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the gas from Qatar, the Kuwaitis, who feel that they've been completely outmaneuvered by this diplomatic move, particularly, as you say, Krish, with Trump apparently saying it's fine. And they're all saying they're not going to pay it. It's a huge crisis, isn't it, for the Gulf monarchies, if indeed the toll booth system goes ahead, but they're blocked, or how does that resolve itself?
Well, I don't know. How do they? You can imagine the Saudis putting a lot more money into their east-west pipeline. They can get, at the moment, they can bypass the Strait of Hormuz with about 5 million barrels a day going out to the Red Sea and the Yanbu port. But will they now double down on that? Will other Gulf countries look at trying to create ways to avoid the Strait of Hormuz? You imagine they would. The problem they face...
They've said it in the UAE, yeah.
The problem they face is it takes time to build these pipelines. And even if you build them, you're going west. And actually, Middle Eastern oil goes east. So how you're making the trip now more costly. And in fact, in the Suez Canal, you can't get those massive, big super tankers. So you're taking smaller ships a longer way. So there's a workaround, but it's much more costly.
Doesn't it bring you back, though, to the talks and what is actually possible? And whether the comprehensive peace that Iran talks about, in which, it will not be attacked again in a year's time or in 2 years' time, is achievable, given how far apart the two lists of points that they have been talking about on either side are. Because, the planning for the future depends on whether you can have a peace or whether they just walk away and say, well, it's over, because neither of them want to go back to war.
You mean it's over without a deal?
Yes.
Yeah, no, I think that's very possible. But then I think one thing is absolutely clear, is that if that happens and the rate of violence and everything else lowers and a kind of normality returns, the Gulf states...
A kind of normality.
Yeah, Gulf states
of normality.
Are going to be spending massively on weapons to refill their stocks of Patriots and Talons and everything else, to fill the gaps that were exposed to drones and whatever, and massively on infrastructure. I mean, it is a fascinating thing that East-West pipeline came out of the 1980s tanker war, that the Saudis made that huge investment in infrastructure. And
to avoid the Iran-Iraq war,
exactly.
actually. So,
the tanker
so
war
they
of the
can
80s.
So they can do it. They can do it again. I think so. The question there, Mark, is: has Iran got to peak power strategically? Up until now, their control of the Strait of Hormuz was all a theoretic idea. They now know they can control the strait for a prolonged period of time and cause these economic repercussions all across the world. But just at this moment, where they are at maximum strategic power, the other Gulf countries are going to make, as Krish, you were saying, these alternative plans, these workarounds. And so does that mean ultimately, down the road, Iran loses some of that strategic power? So short-term volatility, but long-term workaround.
And think about the importance of places like Abu Dhabi in Iranian trade before this. The idea that they can simply go back to business as usual, having bombed Abu Dhabi for the past few weeks, I think is for the birds. So,
or Dubai. Think of the population of Dubai that's Iranian businessmen with oil money they want to get out. How is that going to work?
I mean, Mark, if you think about how the Gulf states are reacting to this, how uniform is it? Do they agree on whether this is a good or a bad thing? And what do you make of these suggestions that the UAE actually launched attacks on Iranian installations themselves?
Well, that's my other indicator for today. I mean, these extraordinary reports that started filtering around yesterday that an Iranian oil terminal on the island of Lavan had been hit by United Arab Emirates jets. Mirage 2000s was the claim. Now, initially, some people just said, look, this is disinformation. The Israelis have tried to imply, for example, that Gulf states were taking part in airstrikes before, but it wasn't the case. But the FARS, the Iranian news agency, one of them, then said it was the UAE. So there seems to be, and indeed Israel and the US have denied hitting this oil terminal.
So why would they be doing it?
Well, the Iranians have been absolutely malleting their oil infrastructure for the last 5 weeks, and indeed Dubai Airport, everything else of value to them. And perhaps at this moment, as the ceasefire was coming in, and indeed the Iranians broke the ceasefire in firing more missiles and drones at the UAE yesterday.
And also the pipeline. One of the things they did in retaliation for saying the ceasefire was broken is hit that Saudi pipeline that goes from east to west. And I think Lavan, the island, has seen a lot more Iranian cargo leaving it in recent weeks because Kharj is being bombed so much. Actually, a lot of Iranian oil exports are going from Lavan now.
Okay.
And so it's maybe a point of, vulnerability that the UAE are exploiting.
Yeah, I mean, for my money, I think it probably was the UAE that did it. And in a way, we've just been talking about the diplomatic aspects of this. And if it ends without a formal agreement, I mean, it is very much the UAE putting themselves back into the conversation in that sense. Now, you asked, what's the difference between these states? Now, before this started, Oman in particular would have said, we have a close relationship with Iran. Qatar would have said, well, our good offices are open to everyone, including Iran. Some of them would have said they had a close relationship, but I think Abu Dhabi would as well, in trading terms at least. What we've seen through the war, if you want to see expressions of Iranian ire or anger or whatever by the count of missiles and drones, we've seen them very heavily hitting the UAE and Kuwait, the states they perceive to be closest to America in the case of Kuwait, closest to Israel in the case of the UAE, less so on some of the other countries. But it's not a huge difference. I think even the Saudis have had about the same number as have been fired at Israel. So they really have been hitting them quite hard. And I think this is an area where you can say an Iranian strategic aim at the outset has failed, which was to
peel them away.
Yes, to get some of these countries to say, no, you can't use our bases to the US. That has completely failed.
Although there are people speaking with huge anger now in those countries at the failure of that alliance to protect them from attacks.
Well, yeah, so they were angry with Israelis, obviously, for killing Khamenei at the start of it, and with the Americans, as you say. And of course, I think
Americans are supposed to be protecting them, but instead they've started the war in this instance. So there is, I think, a feeling that deal hasn't survived contact with oxygen.
Indeed. And Qatar, of course, after the Israeli attack on Hamas there late last year, felt they had a copper-bottom security pact with the US, more extensive, actually, if you read the words, than anything the US has with Israel. But, yeah, I mean, look, I think the Americans would say, well, we've tried to help Qatar in various ways by helping them to shoot down missiles, early warning, all those sorts of things. But yes, I think going forward, and particularly in your scenario, Krish, if this ends without a formal agreement and just sort of sputters to a halt, the Gulf states are left in such an exposed position.
I mean, that sort of informal end to the war, I suppose, is designed to make Iran feel that it could come under attack again at any point. And the Americans are at great pains to say, our people are there, our soldiers are ready. We heard Hegseth sort of bragging away.
But the problem you have,
yesterday,
Krish,
we're ready to go back in.
The problem you have is that the reverse is also true. Then the ships that are trying to get through are also perpetually at risk. So that means that it's a riskier idea to try and export a fifth of the world's global oil and gas supplies. And that is going to have a huge impact.
And already is having an impact on American public opinion, I think. And I think that's the thing I will be watching, I think, over the coming days, because I think one of the most significant moments for me this week where you thought, I think I know where this is going now, and why I didn't get too alarmed by the talk of civilizational erasure was Trump on Monday, on Easter Monday, saying, well, I'd like to go in and get the oil, but the American people want us to come home. And he had read, and someone said, well, how do you know? And he said, I'm good at reading public opinion.
Well, only after he'd been told off by Tucker Carlson. Yes.
But I think it has landed with him at long last that this is unpopular, that this is doing badly for him. And although it is popular with people who identify as MAGA, it is not even popular with non-MAGA Republicans. And it's very unpopular with independents and Democrats. And that surely weakens his ability and his credibility now in terms of, well, we could come back. Because it doesn't really look like they could.
No, and if you've been looking, as I have over the past few weeks, at the indicators of mobilization of sufficient resources, be they warships, be they brigades of army troops or US Marines or whatever, to go in and take the Strait of Hormuz, secure it by military means, we just haven't seen those. And, you know, the idea that you would suddenly mobilize tens of thousands of US reservists, as they did in 2003, for example, to go and do regime change in Iraq, now is, I think, inconceivable in that atmosphere that you're describing. And, of course, with the midterms looming in November.
So what do we think was going on with the mobilization of airborne and Marines, but in ridiculously small numbers to actually take the Strait of Hormuz and Hague Island?
Yeah, I think, as they say, they were developing options, and they weren't necessarily the ones that were frequently thought about, i.e., as you say, take the island or take the Strait. I mean, taking the Strait is clearly a precursor to getting any sort of force into the Gulf. You can't get to the island until you've taken the Strait. And the forces were never sufficient to do that. So what was it for? Well, you know, a battalion landing team, they're trained in stuff like US Marines, I'm talking about, boarding tankers, or other methods, raiding, that you might have done, for example, to take out anti-ship missile batteries in the Strait of Hormuz, or indeed to say, had Trump at some point wanted to say, no, okay, if Iran is going to stop everybody else's oil leaving, we'll stop theirs. He could have done it by means other than destroying terminals, things like that. He could have done it by announcing to shipping owners that we will board any ship that leaves the Gulf with Iranian crude on it.
So instead, they've taken the sanctions off Iranian oil. So it's quite conflicting.
As a way of moderating the price.
Yeah, and there's actually the IRGC have a very mean meme game going on at the moment. The Lego Land, it's worth taking a look at that, where they deride President Trump for playing the market and trying to just get the price down. But you were talking about indicators and the American consumers and how voters will react. And one of the very key indicators is how do people feel it on the ground. And in the US, not only are they feeling it at the gas pump and in diesel, but you've got companies like Delta Airlines saying there's going to be a $2 billion hit to the company, and they're going to not only raise airfares but add on baggage fees. You've got companies like Amazon saying they're going to add surcharges. You've got the US Postal Service saying it's going to add a surcharge because the price of diesel has gone up. And we're going out next week to talk to American farmers about what they're planting, how it's impacting them, because huge amount, again, a fifth of the world's fertilizer comes from the Persian Gulf. So it's going to have an impact. And one of the things, Mark, I'll be looking at is corn prices, because fertilizer is essential.
Are they okay for this This growing season, though?
This growing season, no, because the price has already gone up. So lots of decisions are being made where people are not planting corn, they're planting soy instead. And so what happens at the end of the year is that there'll be less corn around, and that kind of shortage always pushes up prices.
What happens just economically on the whole question of debt as well? I mean, we've seen the price of government bonds going up over the last month. Does this have lasting economic pain for us? So in terms of trying to sort of gauge what is the lasting hangover of this for Britain, let alone, the rest of the world. Fine, one interest rate rise maybe.
Market says 2.
Maybe 2, okay.
Yeah.
And longer term debt payments.
I mean, and compared to a situation where we were going to get interest taken away, we were going to have the Bank of England cutting interest rates. I think what the ceasefire does is it gives a bit of breath to the Chancellor, who, UK has had the worst performing bonds. We've had our yields go up. It's been the most acutely impacted by this crisis. We're an economy, unlike the US economy, we're talking about what will this mean for Americans. The American economy has been quite resilient. So yes, it's hurting people at the pumps, but the US is an energy self-sufficient country. In fact, it's a net exporter. In fact, its companies are doing quite well, refinery companies and oil companies. Its economy is doing well. For Britain, that is not the case. We are energy dependent. We are exposed from a gilt perspective, from a government borrowing perspective. The government doesn't have much fiscal headspace to protect consumers. So it's really posed a massive quandary of what the government can do. So it's kind of wait and see. It's going to be really hoping that this situation solves itself, doesn't become completely long dated where they'll have to act.
And Mark, I mean, ultimately, we haven't really spoken about who blinked. When it comes to why we've got this ceasefire, do you think ultimately it was because Trump was threatening Armageddon, or because the economics of this was looking nightmarish for the whole world?
Look, I think it's been obvious since fairly early on that having failed to achieve regime change, Trump was probably going to have to try and back out, in some sense declare victory. So in that sense, we've been waiting for him to blink. And of course, then there were the ultimatums that weren't acted on in terms of opening the strait, including even the profane ones. So look, in that sense, I think that's fairly apparent. But the one thing I have to say is that over the last couple of weeks, there has been quite a lot of action by the Israelis and Americans against what you could call infrastructure targets, whether it's the steel mills, the chemical works, the bridges, other transport nodes in Iran. Now, whether that had some role in getting the Iranians to the table, I think is a fascinating question, because certainly for the first few weeks, they were making it absolutely clear they had no interest in negotiation. We've been here twice before with the Americans. We got bombed both times. That was their line, don't even pick up the phone. But clearly, they are now seriously entertaining and trying to get to terms. So did that shift towards infrastructure targets have an effect? I'm not sure. And what state would you say, Helia, the Iranian economy is going to be in when this...
I mean, this is the problem. The Iranian economy was really struggling in the first place. I mean, the reason for all of those demonstrations that you saw wasn't just political. It was actually business guilds coming out and coming to the street because they were so frustrated and fed up with the Iranian economy. All of these attacks, unfortunately, are going to hurt the Iranian people. You're talking about Iran, IRGC, the regime being strengthened, but the Iranian people are going to really suffer.
The other thing I will definitely be looking out for now that we're in the ceasefire, and it is harder for Iran to keep saying, well, we can't tell you anything about who's saying what and why we haven't seen the supreme leader, is who's really running things. Who is really in charge? Now, Ghalibaf, the speaker, is the man the Americans keep talking about, and he's the man apparently going to Islamabad. Does that make you think, well, he can't actually be the man at the top then? You don't send the man right at the top, do you, to to the talks?
No. Well, and indeed, JD Vance is not the man at the top. One gets the sense he's almost being sent to be bound into the war, whether or not the talks succeed or not, having distanced himself in various ways. I think there was some reporting from the White House yesterday that they consider Mojtaba Khamenei to be very much in charge and have had exchanged messages with him, and that he's signed up to this idea of peace talks.
So he is the regime change they're talking about.
Exactly. It's a very different regime, the president says, Trump, that is. So that, in theory, I guess he is in charge.
Yes.
Or Galebaf, or Vahidi, the IRGC commander.
Yes, but these people will have to sort of start emerging, you would have thought, if the war is over. For the foreseeable future, and then these things will become slightly more clear, you'd hope.
You've got the IRGC basically controlling a lot of Iranian oil, and you've got a whole series of Iranian oligarchs that run Iranian oil with the help of different intermediaries through shipping and infrastructure companies and shadow fleets and shell companies, all the way with the help of China, for example. Those characters are not the characters that are going to turn up in Pakistan, but they are the people who have control over Iran's finances and in control of Iran's revenues.
The final surprise I just wanted to talk to you about was Netanyahu. Netanyahu started out this war apparently as the master manipulator who got Trump to take this decision, who had gone over to Washington, had done the briefing, persuaded the Americans that this was the right thing to do. And you could see that initially it was almost as if no matter how long the war goes on, this is a strategic win for Israel because it weakens Iran. It weakens Iran's ability to attack Israel in the long term. Politically now, Netanyahu is under huge attack at home. They're saying this is a strategic failure, a total mess. He was left out of this last process of ceasefire talks, and he's almost gone from being the surefire winner to a loser.
Yes, and if you look at the way the Israeli offensive against Hezbollah in late 2024 or the so-called 12-day war last year they worked out pretty well, or looked pretty good at the time from Netanyahu's perspective. He chose war one too many times, I think, and now he's been exposed to all kinds of negative consequences. The fact that Iran suddenly, by the Strait of Hormuz maneuver, gets a way to refill its coffers, to leverage its control over global energy, all of those things are things that I think put Netanyahu in a pretty bad position. And as you say, Krish, political opponents like Yair Lapid and Naftali Bennett have been absolutely trenchant in their criticism of where Netanyahu has brought the country. So far from being the sort of victorious campaign that he hoped might launch his re-election bid, I think he is now in considerable political difficulty over it.
Can I add in another kind of financial indicator that is critical? There's been a couple of instances where we've had some serious irregularities on trading that have raised huge questions. You've had
Hexeth's trader.
You've got, before the ceasefire agreement was announced and before the extension period to think about it, there were two massive trades, which are very unusual. We talked to the, Commodities and Metals Exchange about the one that just happened this week. $950 million. That's 1% of daily average outside the settlement period. That's 3,000 bets on oil futures were made. Very unusual. And there's a big question about whether the authorities in the US are going to properly look at this.
What, the implication being?
These are public markets where people have taken massive bets. And, there is a lot of question marks about whether they had inside information.
How long does it take to work these things out that they're happening? I mean, could you use them as indicators? I mean, are they almost real-time?
Do we need to look at trading volumes?
Not the pizzas in Pentagon City. But we've spoken about all of these things short-term and some long-term things. Yeah. is the financial probity or credibility of the US going to be a long-term casualty of this? Because we always think of the SEC as this powerful regulator that goes in, gets the guilty men and women. Why isn't it working?
US regulators, the only ones who have guns with them at the same time. Why isn't it working? There's a lot of things that don't seem to be working in the traditional institutional way. I think there is a move away from one of the long-term trends is de-dollarization. We were talking about what do the Iranians want to be paid in. They don't want to be paid in dollars. And you're seeing other countries do that. You're also seeing other countries look at how they create a secondary kind of trading system, economic system that isn't reliant on the world. It's very complicated, Mark, because at the same time, the US market is completely frothy because the idea of AI is, people don't want to miss the next Google, the next Apple, the next Facebook. So they don't want to sell everything. They just can't resist the idea of getting in the market. And that is actually giving President Trump quite a lot of cushion. You talked about, is he worried about, treasuries going up and that looking terrible and oil prices going up? US stock market has given him a lot of cushion to do this because it's surprising that there's some dissonance there.
Well, this is what they call exquisite privilege, isn't it, in terms of US financials? Different rules to the rest of the world.
Well, the reserve currency of the world, you can't get away from it.
Just finally, Mark, what will you be looking out for this weekend in these talks to work out whether they're going anywhere or whether this is just sort of face-saving process to let things fizzle out?
Well, as you said, Krish, I think, who turns up and says what from the Iranian side? And I think any indicators that there's pliability on their rather maximalist 10 points that they were circulating. There was the battle of whose 10 points were we really looking at. But theirs are clearly pretty maximalist. And, there's this awful, dare I use the word tragic history in a way of Iran overreaching diplomatically at various moments, asking for too much. Some people say they've only really given in twice. Once was the end of the war with Iraq in 1988, and the other time was that 2015 nuclear deal. Every other negotiation, they've overplayed their hand. So that's what I'm looking for. Is evidence of, dare one use the word realism, and a real willingness to make a deal.
Well, that's it for this edition of Fourcast Indicators. Until next time.
Goodbye.